Hi, this is Amy for our assignment on the brain, the triune brain in fight, flight, or freeze trauma response. So, the triune brain theory comes from the work of Paul D. MacLean. He served as the director of the National Institute of Mental Health for their Laboratory of Brain Evolution and Behavior. He proposed the brain evolved in layers, one on top of the other, and each function works independently, but the brain is like three brains in one, or triune, which is apropos because his father was a minister, and it seems from my research that he didn't quite take that all into account, the religion and the triune. And so anyway, the brain has three parts: the reptilian complex, the paleo-mammalian complex, and the neo-mammalian complex. So the reptilian complex, the oldest layer, the R complex, is responsible for our instinctual behaviors such as aggression and reproduction. And this would be the brainstem and the cerebellum. The paleo-mammalian complex, or the limbic system, controls emotions, social behavior, memory formation, and this is where the amygdala, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus are all located, more in the middle of our brain. They said like the temple where the jaw meets the ear, the temple kind of straight back. And then the neo-mammalian complex, or the neocortex, is kind of the upper or frontal part of our brains where the prefrontal cortex is. And this is responsible for cognitive functions like language, problem solving, decision making. And MacLean said that this is what kind of separates us from the animals. So these three parts are separable and chemically distinct. He wrote that man, it appears, has inherited essentially three brains: frugal nature in developing her paragon threw nothing away. The oldest of his brains is basically reptilian. The second has been inherited from lower mammals, and the third and newest brain is the late mammalian development, which reaches a pinnacle in man and gives him the unique power of symbolic language. This theory is an evolutionary theory, obviously. So as Christians, we might have take issue with that if we believe that God created the brain and it didn't evolve. And critics of this theory, it seems, have really come after like 1990, because technology has evolved and allowed us to learn a lot more about the brain than what MacLean learned in like the 50s, 60s, 70s from studying animals. And two critics are Terrence Deacon of UC Berkeley and Daniel Toker of UCLA. And they argued that MacLean is basically wrong because our brains aren't that different from reptiles or fish or less intelligent mammals, that every mammal has a neocortex and all vertebrates have structures like a cortex, and that the biological structures are typically just modified versions of the older structures. So the mammalian neocortex isn't really a completely new structure like MacLean thought it was. It's just a modification of the reptilian cortex. So I, as a Christian, I take this all with just a grain of salt, because I believe our brain was created uniquely, and that it didn't evolve necessarily. But I appreciate the science that goes into these theories, and this is how we learn. So what we know about the amygdala is that our survival response is triggered in the lower brain as flight, fright, or freeze, and that sends things up to our hippocampus and our amygdala. And we know that the brain can remember traumatic responses or experiences. And so as counselors or healthcare professionals, we know that trauma can change the brain significantly, and this can help guide our approaches and treatments. So flight, flight, or freeze is how the body responds to perceived threats. It's involuntary, and it involves a number of physiological changes that help somebody prepare to either fight, which would be to take action against the danger, flee, which would be escaping, or freezing, which would be being immobilized. I saw one or two things that put forth a fourth option as well, which would be fawning or appeasing. Um, I'm thinking that this would come into play with domestic abuse, or maybe in like sex trafficking, where you're trying to appease the person who represents a threat to you in order to prevent harm. But I did not see a ton of stuff on that in the research that I did or in textbooks from previous classes. So I'm thinking this might be something that's new in trauma or counseling research. So when a person is confronted with a stressor, it's interpreted and we start our emotional response. And that pathway involves like neural activation of the hypothalamus by the amygdala. And we know that the memory of that emotional event or traumatic event is imprinted then onto the amygdala, and that holds on to the intensity and the impulse of the emotion from that trauma. So I saw in one source that it compared the amygdala to like the smoke detector of the brain, signaling to the person that something is wrong and they need to react. So when a young person experiences traumatic events, we now know from newer research that the brain adapts to survive. And with positive interactions from like safe people, it helps early brain development, whereas experiencing negative traumatic events will impair brain development. The best research I saw on newer research was a 2002 paper called "The Brain is Adaptive, Not Triune: How the Brain Responds to Threat, Challenge, and Change." This was published in the Frontiers in Psychiatry journal, and the writers kind of refute the triune brain theory. They argue first that the brain did not evolve in stages, as McLean hypothesized. Second, they say that brain structures don't function independently of one another. Instead, there's always activity in the amygdala and the limbic system, as in the cortical areas and the brainstem. So during emotional responses, all parts of the brain are working. Third, they say that newer research, current research, has provided new ways of understanding how the brain responds to stress and adapts to internal and external environments. And that fear research specifically tells us that there's no fear brain circuit that just turns on but is otherwise dormant. Instead, the brain networks always have some level of activity that's affecting how we process information. Instead, what changes is the relative activity of different brain networks. So networks are differentially activated based on need, which makes sense. They propose an adaptive brain instead of a triune brain, which emphasizes interdependence and plasticity of brain regions and the brain's ability to kind of predict and adapt to future needs and conditions. So instead of 3 brain regions, the brain networks are working together interdependently. So we also know now that the amygdala can become overactive, in people who have extensive trauma histories. And this change can cause survivors to become hypersensitive to threats, more prone to stress or anxiety, especially with childhood trauma. And that early trauma exposure can interrupt the development of the amygdala, which leads it to misfire and produce false alarms that would constantly activate fight or flight responses. And one screening tool that clients could be used with clients is the ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experience Screening. So if you have a client who you feel like there could be something in their past that's causing stress or anxiety or leading to the constant fight or flight responses, that might be a good tool to use to see if they experienced childhood trauma. And you will find my references on a sheet attached in Blackboard. Thank you so much.